All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Perceptive podcast here on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. I am Josh Placer, and for this episode, we're going to be talking games in education. What is it like to use video games in the classroom, and kind of what is the state of game-based learning today? And my guest, he is a teacher as well as the host of the Engage show that talks more about game-based learning and education in this respect. So please welcome to the cast, Jeremy Yanofsky, and hopefully I didn't butcher that too badly.
That's exactly right. Hello, everybody.
Nice. How are you doing, Jeremy?
I'm doing pretty well. I'm out here outside in kind of sunny California right now. It's a bit colder than you would expect, but
I'm right now in lovely, rainy and foggy New Jersey, where it is pouring all day long.
nice. Oh, hooray, wintertime.
Yes. But it's great to finally have you on. We've been talking about doing like an educational based discussion here for one of the Perceptive podcasts, and the challenge of getting time zones and schedules focus is always a fun thing. But it's great to finally have you on.
I'm really glad to be here. Yeah.
Let's make sure that all the announcements and such went out. Yep, we are live. So, if anyone watching this live recorded has any questions for Jeremy, feel free to leave them in the comments or in the recorded one, and we'll try and get to them as they show up. So, to get things started with, since this is your first time on the cast, could you talk a little bit about, who you are, what is the Engage show, and kind of what has been your experience with video games or games in the classroom?
Oh, absolutely. So I've served as a classroom educator and ed tech coach in a variety of different roles over the years, actually on both coasts. And I started Engage at the time when I was in between teaching jobs, when I was working for a nonprofit that was very invested in researching how games and apps and web-based tools could be leveraged in the classroom, but also we had at the time were working on formulating an online community where we could bring teachers together, talk about all sorts of games, whether it's board games, LARPs, video games, what have you, and generate ideas from in-house, so to speak, of how you could use these games to facilitate learning, all sorts of different things in your class, and then get the community in to talk about it as well. And that community was alive for a short time, but unfortunately the nonprofit dissolved. But I've gone on to make Engage because I really wanted to. I've loved being in education. Right now, I'm looking for new opportunities outside of a formal classroom environment. But I've really loved helping other people learn because I felt I had a knack for helping people figure things out in unconventional ways. And I also, my original childhood dream was to make some sort of TV show or movie or something. And so I thought, what if that would be cool to be like the Bill Nye of game-based learning, if that's a thing. So over the years, and I also just really wanted to learn about the video production process. And so over the years, I've produced episodes of Engage on EduLARP, Transmedia, ARGs, and using video games like Portal 2 and the Stanley Parable in the classroom, a little bit of Minecraft as well, of course, and board games like Catan and card games like Hanabi. And I've just really enjoyed doing that over the years. And there's going to be eventually more to come very soon.
Sounds good. And yet, like, for me, a lot of what I do has been trying to, like, bridge that gap between, like, academia and the game industry. Because I'm sure, as you're well aware of, like, there's not a lot of very accurate or very, like, credible information when it comes to game design on the internet. And I was looking at this back in, like, 2004, 2005. And even, like, a lot of the stuff that I talk about here and on my site and, even in my books, it's still, like, relatively, I think, considered, like, new to, like, actually sit down and have a discussion about what makes a good platformer. How do you get, interesting level design in your games? And it is such a very fascinating topic. And I guess first question then, for the Engage show, for people watching us who may not have heard it, what is it about? Like, what do you cover on it?
So on Engage, which is at youtube.com/engage show, I just had to add the word show at the end of it because somebody already had engaged. It's like, all right. And I guess you can't add an exclamation mark on a URL, but whatever. I've gone it with in the approach of thinking, when I was in that other position, I was in the position of researching these different games and thinking about how they could be leveraged in the classroom in all sorts of different ways, and thinking about, well, other than this tiny little community I'm a part of here, nobody really probably talks about these kinds of things. So I produced this show trying to think from the standpoint of a teacher, especially a classroom educator, who might think, oh, yeah, maybe it would be cool to use games in the classroom like Among Us or something like that. But maybe, I've only heard the kids talk about Among Us. I don't even know what it is. So describing like, what is the game, a little bit about how do you play it, how do you even get a game like that into your classroom, especially if it's like a video game, since that can require a bunch of other steps in terms of IT or negotiating with administration, is like to assure them that yes, I'm going to use it for appropriate purposes, which is not quite as much of a hurdle these days, actually. Um, but going through the show with that, and adding my blend of some humor when I can as well in there to give it some personality. I didn't want it to be just a straight up PowerPoint of a show of like, well, here's the bullet points of what's Among Us, how do I download it, blah, blah, blah. I wanted it to be a little bit more something that I personally also would actually want to watch. And so and also thought about it from the perspective, since I had been working with parents and students too, and all these different teacher lives I've gone through, thinking like, well, if a parent or if a student came across the show first before teachers in their community, maybe they would watch it and get jazzed about how to use whatever game in the classroom, and maybe they would bring it to the teacher and be like, how come we don't do this? Can we do some of this? So that was the approach I went into with making Engage.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure, like, from your perspective, and something that I've seen over the last, like, I would say maybe 10 to 15 years, has been that challenge of, I think, adopting video games in the classroom, getting teachers, people who are in charge of education at schools, interested in using this. A friend of ours, Stephen Isaacs, who I did a cast with, I think this was like last year, somewhere around there. May have even been like right around this time as well, which would be funny. But we were talking about like how much time he spent trying to like rally and get people interested in using video games there. So I guess the next question for you, Jeremy, is like, how has it been, I guess, from an educator standpoint? Like showing off like games in the classroom, showing off the Engage show, and like I guess like trying to get people on board with this idea of having either game-based learning or even just teaching games or game design in the class.
That's a great question. When I first started doing this, around the time of my first full-time teaching job back in 2008, the idea, especially of using video games in the classroom in particular, was pretty novel, I think, in the community I was in. But as long as I, as a teacher, came up with a compelling case of here's what I'm going to do, here are the lesson plans that I've come up with, and so forth, and how it fits into the greater context of what we're trying to accomplish here in this class, then the administrators, went along with it, and then it was gangbusters. And funny enough, in later teacher lives, even when I was a director of educational technology at Chatsworth Hills Academy, I was able to. I didn't encounter as much resistance as one might think to the idea of bringing something like Minecraft into the classroom, as much as I did with introducing class blog platforms. Like that caused more of a stir, which was not at all what I expected. So but nowadays I feel like I know I definitely follow Steve Isaacs closely and Mike Washburn and the folks at Clever, like everything they're doing with Fortnite in the classroom is really exciting. And all the everything that's come about in, I don't know when exactly it really first started hitting, but getting esports in the classroom, people have been really excited about that, and it's been it's popped a lot of questions into my mind of how people have gotten really excited about the esports, but not maybe not as much about bringing game design into the classroom. When it was, I would think, wouldn't you be excited about both?
Hmm.
um, and so I don't know, but there's a lot of interesting things to explore in that area.
Hmm. Yeah, and like I'm working with some teachers here on the East Coast about maybe doing like a student game jam or trying to do more with like student video game clubs, and it
Mm,
is that kind of very interesting. Like he is definitely not a the fan, or he prefers more game based learning in the classroom as opposed to esports, because he's looking at this I think 100% from the education standpoint. Like, what can you get out of learning video games or learning design? And I think
mhm.
it is that interesting dichotomy between kind of esports and kind of game based learning. That there are, I guess here's another question for you. Like, from my perspective, as someone from the outside of education, it still feels like there is that stigma that video games in the classroom just means we're just going to sit and play Call of Duty, or we're just going to sit and play whatever games for the entire class and nothing gets learned.
Mm.
And I was wondering if that's something that you've ran into, or like, how do you dispel like that myth of having video games in the classroom, and what can it bring to students and even to teachers?
Well, I would dispel that in the sense of treating the games that you use either as a sandbox or as a text. You know, coming from an English teaching background, that's really where my strong suit is in perceiving how to leverage games in the classroom. Like when I brought in Portal 2 years ago, when Valve was in collaboration, I think, with Games for Change, and they created the whole Learning with Portals platform. There was a big emphasis on STEM or STEAM and
Mm-hmm.
how you could use the level maker to make create levels that could teach you concepts in chemistry and physics. But I went in with Portal 2, working with students at the time who had some learning disabilities who were really struggling with learning how to write a story with characters that conveyed any sort of authentic dialogue, that things wouldn't just sound wooden or like in the John Candy movie Delirious, where it sounds like they're reading straight from the script. Like the butler exits and he would say like, no, now I got them reading stage directions. Uh, you know, and I talk about this in that episode. But when I brought that in and they played through the opening scene of that where they interacted with Wheatley, and then that would help the light bulb go off of like, oh, that's what a conversation should feel like. That's where bringing in games in that sense too, and using them just like when somebody would use any sort of novel or poetry or play in an English classroom, or whatever text or other sort of form of media you'd be using in social studies. There's just really an incredible wealth of opportunities there, and um, I know if I could make Engage full time, I've got like such a laundry list of games that I really would dive into. And like, like I've been dying to make episodes on Hades, and I got really excited when they announced a sequel to Hades at the Game Awards. Like, yes, even more. Or like Journey and Hyper Light Drifter and Undertale, all sorts of other games out there that would be great for all kinds of different accompaniments. And even to think like, all right, well, maybe not necessarily have your entire English language arts class just become 100% video games, but you could pair to think of, you could pair this game with this text. These two go together well. If you're reading, Lord of the Flies, uh, you could, maybe it makes sense to pair it with Among Us or what have you. So, um, and yeah, I don't know. Otherwise, to think of the question of resistance, I hadn't encountered so much resistance over the years as much as the just other people just not in the environments that I worked in, just not really knowing how do we even go about any of this, because there's not really sort of best practices out there as much as there is of like, you know in an English language arts classroom of like, well, conventionally probably in this year of high school you're doing American literature, and this time you're doing British literature, and this time you're doing world literature, and that's kind of how it's been. Games are so novel and so are still so novel, even though, as I'm sure you know, like games themselves have such a rich history of being used for learning, even back to the time of the ancient Greeks or even beyond. So it's funny how these things are perceived as being so novel and unique when really they've been used for millennia. And video games, video games are just, I feel, one tool in the toolkit. It's the reason on Engage where I haven't only devoted time to video games. I thought when earlier when I had worked with some game designers out of a nonprofit that unfortunately does not exist anymore called Seekers Unlimited, they were creating live action role play or LARP scenarios. And I thought that was really some incredible magic, because then in these environments, or the episode in Practomime I talk about, where people not just took a game and brought it into class, but had it be their entire class from top to bottom was a game. But that's where, really, to throw those terms of immersive and interactive, because the kids are really embodying the characters themselves. That really has blown my mind, and I feel like that should also be so much more of a thing than it is. Which is, it's just weird that it's not.
Yeah, I think the example you just gave about like Portal 2 is a really good one, because a lot of people, I think, the other aspect when we talk about like games in the classroom, I think a lot of people tend to focus on very like, I guess, sandbox or very like production style games. You mentioned Roblox, I think, earlier, or I'm sorry, Minecraft. There's, of course, Roblox, what I use on the thumbnail, Super Mario Maker. That there are some games that are inherently like kind of built for a classroom setting, like any game that has that like sandbox or that creativity. I've said this story before, but I remember back in, a long time ago, like 1995, 1996, that one of my science teachers was using SimCity 2000 as a way of teaching city infrastructures and the environment, the impact a city can have. And that is, of course, a really great example. But then, as you said, with using a game like Portal 2 to teach creative writing, like, that really interests me about having games that we normally would not, I think, like, talk about, at least in the educational standpoint, but can have educational applications.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the sandbox games, it's just like really any other tool in your toolkit. Like everything has their own distinct advantages and purpose and how they can be leveraged. The Minecraft and Fortnites of the world, give the big platform for people to have more freedom when it comes to really trying to do something with project-based learning, especially. But then, of course, we can use games like, Undertale, Hyper Light Drifter, Journey, Celeste, Florence, just all sorts of these other, especially like I felt like there should be a really strong bond between the indie game community and the video game world and education, because so much of what the indie game world, I've seen anyway, has done is all these rich narrative driven experiences that could absolutely be used in humanities classrooms all over the place. Return of the Obra Dinn too, for mystery. I mean, there's just a wealth of possibility there. And all these that I'm mentioning and throwing out is like, I haven't made episodes on these yet. One of these days.
Yeah.
But yeah. So.
And that's always that challenge, because again, like, you are talking to someone who has played a lot of games in 2022, and
yeah.
I haven't sat down and actually calculate what my the year list is going to be this year, but it's going to be definitely more than 10. And yeah, like, the indie space has been fascinating. Like, I've been watching it grow over the past decade, and there are some fantastic games, and I think it's great to hear from from an educator about games like Return of the Obra Dinn. I can think of stuff like the Talos Principle. And you mentioned Hades. I loved Hades, and I also went like a little woohoo when I saw the Hades 2 premiere at the Game Awards. I want to ask you about this point. One of the challenges, I think, of some of these games is the content that's in them. And I think this has always been that the other side when we talk about games in the classroom, because I know somewhere there's a parent who's thinking, oh, they want to play Mortal Kombat. They want to show a game like Mortal Kombat to teens. I can think of some fantastic indie games that have some very rich stories that I would never want a child to see, because they are very dark titles. And I think another really good stand on this respect would be something like Disco Elysium. Disco
Mm.
Elysium is a fantastic game. It is probably one of the best in terms of the choose your own adventure style. But conversely, it is a game that deals with very mature topics. It's not something you would want to see in elementary or high school. And I
Mm.
think that's also the another part of this challenge is that video games have had that stigma for a long time that either they are super for kids, they're nothing but toys and all that, or they're incredibly mature. We can't have anyone under the age of 18 look at these titles. And I guess from your perspective, again, as an educator, how, like, is that kind of stigma, or is that kind of discussion still happening? Because I remember this again back in the 90s when the
Mm.
whole M-rated scare was going at full force with the rise of the ESRB. How is that like today in classrooms? Like, are teachers and parents, I guess, like more, I guess, understanding or more accommodating in that respect?
Well, I mean, that's something I've tried to address and engage as well when I talk about, especially when I'm thinking from the perspective of introducing, why not bring something like Portal 2 into the classroom to somebody who's never played Portal 2, maybe never even picked up a controller, has no idea what this game is, and using the ERCRB system as a point of reference. I've even sometimes, when talking about various board games, have pointed to the ESRB and be like, well, this could be like a T for teens in my perspective, because I don't know if the board game world has an equivalent to the ESRB. I mean, like
Mhm.
there's, when you look at a box, it might say for ages 8 and up or something, but um, this should be like a standardized thing. But anyways, the it is an interesting challenge, and there are games out there like maybe your Bioshocks of the world too, where I would think like, yeah, there would be some elements of this that would be cool for certain purposes to bring into a classroom, but parental advisory warning, like here are the reasons why you should be careful. And I think, as long as you have the knowledge to go in with it as an educator, to know what's in the game, know what sort of content might be in there that might be risque, or that whatever it might be, to think like how to think really deeply about, yeah, what sort of context would this make sense in, what sort of age level would it be make sense in, and if I was in a high school environment that where I could use something like this war of mine, you know, really describing to administrators and parents ahead of time too, of like, yes, I'm keenly aware of the mature content in this game. Here's what we're going to do with it. Here's where we're going to have the serious discussions about it, and lay it out all from the beginning, especially going with the preparation. Certainly not go um, don't for something like that, don't make it a spontaneous thing of like, guess what, everybody, today we are going to play this war of mine. You've never heard of this game, but
Oh
here we go.
no.
Like, no, we're not gonna do that. But um but yes, I mean, I think as long as you go in with the preparation and uh you know the advanced planning in that regard, and you're keenly aware of it, and you may communicate, there can be situations where you can apply it. Also, certainly educators will know their communities that they're in best, and will know with their parents and their administrators and with the students too, whether or not they can, what, even just that first question of too, like, when you're in this class of students, who's in there as a teacher, them really well over time, to get a sense of like, well, do you think that this class could actually handle the serious subject matter of even something like Celeste? Would they take
Hmm.
that seriously, or would they just kind of laugh it off? So, you know it comes from all of that.
Hmm. So, my next question for you, Jeremy, I think this one will probably aim more at like any teachers or educators, hopefully watching this either live or recorded. When it comes to, I think, building a lesson plan or building like a course or however you want around either a video game or game-based learning, do you have any advice or suggestions for like someone else watching who's thinking, how do I do this? Like, how can I start, setting something up for a classroom in a
Mm.
future year or a future session?
Um, Man, that is a fantastic question. I mean, a lot of it comes down to thinking about your goals and learning objectives, and what, from that standpoint of, whatever subject matter you're dealing with, what is it that I want my students to be able to accomplish, by the time we get to the end of X, Y, and Z, and what games would be most appropriate to use for that, or if it's like a LARP situation, can we squeeze in something that could be a powerful experience to facilitate learning about ancient Mesopotamia, for example. It was one that I was a part of once upon a time. Um, the I've always gone from the standpoint of, like I talk about in the episode with the Pericles group. I was most inspired by them to think about the relationship between games and learning, and how it should be the learning objectives and the play objectives should be as close to the one-to-one as you possibly can. Like whatever you're doing in the game should parallel very closely with whatever you're hoping the students will get out of the experience and what they should learn with various skill sets and whatnot. So, like, we're not doing Math Blaster where you just answer a bunch of questions and then you get to shoot random stuff in space that has nothing to do with the math problems you just said. Like, there needs to be the one-to-one connection. Or like if I'm playing the Pericles group Practimime situation, where they had the idea, even when you, at the very beginning of the game, when you first are introduced to the environment that you're in, and you travel back in time to, I think it was either ancient Greece or ancient Rome, one of the two. But you step out of your time machine as you and your teammates of other classmates, and you first meet somebody in this environment. The first thing, they are going to have a conversation with you and ask you, "Who are you?" But it's going to be, oh, it was because it was in Latin. I think that's Roman. So they ask you like, "Who are you? What's your name?" And you need to be able to respond in Latin. So you have to think in the game of, how do I do that? And that gets you to figure out how to talk in that language, and that's the learning part of the learning objective of that class. So I've tried to go in, make the relationship as organic and meaningful as possible. So I'm not just throwing in, something that has no relation to whatever, like I said, the Math Blaster example. Because yeah, it's fun to shoot stuff in space, but if it has nothing to do with the calculations that you just figured out, then what are we doing? So
Mm-hmm. Yep, and to your point about Math Blaster, like again, I remember all the Broderbarn Learning Company games back in the day, and that actually brings, I think, a really good question. What are your thoughts on, I guess, the concept or the topic of edutainment? Because this is like one of those words that you can say to some kids, and they're just like, it'll look like, as my voice is dying, that it'll look like you're torturing them when it comes to, as you said, like there are some games that it's just like, okay, you get to walk and jump. Now, solve a math problem. Hey, you walk in this room and you turn on a light. Now answer what was the Gettysburg Address about? That it feels very much like the education and what is going on in the game are just not syncing up in that respect.
yeah, it's like kind of like Mario is missing as well, where you're going through and you're doing kind of like where in the world is Carmen San Diego experience, except for you're playing what you think is a Mario game where you get to run and jump and shoot fireballs, but you don't get to do any of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think as I've talked about this in some of my past episodes of Engage as well, where the kids are going to see immediately right through that. I know if I as a player am going to see through that kind of thing, and you start playing a game, immediately like, oh, this is just a front for flashcards or that sort of thing, and like, yeah, I'm not really going to want to spend my time doing this, and that's where that whole phenomenon. I think it was Professor Amy Breckman who coined the term of chocolate covered broccoli. Because like you hand a piece of broccoli to a kid, and just because you put chocolate syrup on it doesn't mean that they're gonna, they know what's there. And I mean, I love broccoli, but still, I would never put chocolate syrup on it. So, um, and that might be some of the thing too when you talked earlier about the stigma with using games in the classroom, where some people out there might possibly think, oh yeah, I mean they're just gonna sit there and play Fortnite all day long. I mean, my kid does that at home. Like, what's the difference? I'm not sending them to school just to do the same thing. But
Yeah.
it's like, no, we're using this as a tool, as a platform to facilitate all kinds of exciting learning opportunities. And so that might also be, that perception of edutainment might, you know, be an obstacle there. But I think it's just a sort of initial hurdle too. If you have a strong program at a school as a teacher, you're supported by your administration, you start to get the gears turning, you start to get in there using, whether it's Minecraft or Fortnite or any of the other games you mentioned. It won't be long before the students and the parents alike will start to see, like, oh, okay, yeah, this is really cool. Like, we are using these games to make these strong connections to what we're learning about. And so we're not just but I mean, I hate to say also, we're not just playing a game, because there's huge
Yeah.
value in play in and of itself too. And you're battling that misconception too, of like, oh, we're just playing games. It's like, no, but we're playing games because they're incredible experiences to really get so much more out of than just looking at a textbook, or what have you. So.
Mm-hmm. So I guess you may have answered this next question then earlier, but I kind of want to see if there is anything new to it. But to your point about getting something out of video games, like we said, like there are games that are obviously very geared towards education. Well, I'm curious, like what is like the most, I guess, like non-education game that you felt could really fit in education? You mentioned, of course, this War of Mine and Portal. Any other, I guess, like notable examples?
um I mean, well, this War of Mine being a huge one, I think I read an article some months ago. I forget if it was Poland. I want to say it was Poland. Like, some schools there have made it actually a mandatory part of their curriculum. So, um, the most non-educational game that you could put in there. Even before the whole learning with portals thing came about, I would even think Portal 2, that's surprising. But even, like I mentioned, Bioshock earlier, and using that as a tool, there's certainly a lot of relations related to Ayn Rand and all that literature. And There was a professor who was part of the Pericles group, Roger Travis, wrote extensively about that, and Plato's the allegory of the cave, and how you get to the point in the game. Of course, spoilers for a 20-year-old game at this point, uh, where like, Andrew Ryan says, "Would you kindly," or like, the whole business with thinking about, do I even have free will, and that's what the whole game is about. But it's the I think the challenge, even with a game like Hades too, to think of like, well, here's how we could use this game as a text in a classroom. But of course, there is a lot of meaty game interaction, that somebody had designed this to be used, more as a game and not as an educational tool. And so you have a lot of these combat situations in the game, or even like a game like Celeste, where like you have a lot of tight, tricky platforming you got to get through in order to get into the story. And so, but what's exciting is when you get to a game like Celeste and they give you something like an assist mode, or I think in Hades has some sort of a god mode where, that enables the player. Because this is something that a lot of people talk about when it comes to, well, what are the challenges of using these kind of games in the classroom, is like, well, having literacy as a player to play Hades, or something, even if it was, I don't know, Mario Kart, to think about, well, somebody has to have a certain set of skills to be good at this game in order to make progress at it. Um, that can be a challenging part of it too. But for when it comes to like my most recent episode of the show, talking about the Stanley Parable, and how, this is effectively what some people would call like a walking simulator. And so, okay, as a player, I don't need to have an extensive set of skills to make it through this game, because really all I'm doing is walking in a 3D environment. Um, but that can be, those things are a challenge to address as well. Um, I don't know what other sort of non games that you would not think of to be used as educational tools. I mean, probably almost anything I've covered on the show so far, or anything that we've talked about. Um, yeah, and I think that's the fun for me too, and digging into these things and be like, yeah, it can be a thing that can astound some students too. Of like, oh, I never thought you would bring in Uncharted as another one too. Like, I didn't never thought we would be playing The Last of Us in the middle of class or whatever it is. And yeah, those are not games that I personally have brought into a classroom, but I have seen other people talk about using them in like a high school environment or even like older middle school, and that's really exciting to me to think about. Like, oh man, yeah, sure, you could totally do that. So
and speaking about kind of like action or reflex driven games like that, we've spent the last like 30 minutes or so talking about kind of from the educational standpoint of game based learning and bringing games in the classroom. In terms of, I guess, like teaching someone like game design, teaching
mm.
someone mechanics, what kind of approach or what are your thoughts on like that respect of bringing a game in and trying to teach someone, okay, this is what we can learn as a platformer. This is what we can learn excuse me, as a strategy game and so on. Like, how does that approach differ to say again, as we were talking about with using Portal or this War of Mine as kind of the tool to teach like another lesson?
Yeah, absolutely. This is where I was really excited a couple of teacher lives ago to finally have the opportunity to teach a full on game design class. Like in past teacher
Mm-hmm.
lives, when I worked at Chatsworth Hills Academy, I was able to do it sort of in the fringes of like when I taught a middle school design class, it could take like some time within a unit to do a bit about game design. But it wasn't until two teacher lives ago when I had the opportunity to teach a whole at least a semester long class. And like, this is really what we're going to focus on. It's not going to be on the fringes. So um, I think it's a tricky thing I found it to be a tricky thing in terms of wanting to balance uh, providing students with some kind of insight into, like you said, the different, however you might classify a game too, even just thinking about, you know, what even is a platformer, what qualifies as a strategy game, especially for like, you think from the perspective of the student, and maybe some students in the class don't play a lot of games, or maybe if they do love playing games, maybe they're just zeroed in Fortnite and they don't really play. They've never played a platformer in their lives. Uh, I'm sure they've heard of Mario, but they've never really booted it up. So, uh, it's an interesting push and pull of like wanting to provide them with some kind of context for different genres and ideas that they may otherwise have not have been exposed to, but also trying not to do it too much, because if you're challenging them to create their own game, that you don't want to more spell out like, well, you should do this kind of game, because it's like, well, I want them to create their own game of what they want to create. So uh, there was a bit of interesting push and pull there, but it was kind of a really neat experience to you know I mean, with the high school students that I was working with at the time, of like, yeah, they hadn't played, most of them, Mario or a turn-based RPG like a Final Fantasy or an Undertale. So like, a Metroidvania. They haven't played Metroid or Castlevania, and so it would be fun, to have those chats about like, well, this is what this game used to be. This is what this came from, and like, hey, if you've even been playing, the 2018 God of War Ragnarok, like this is where a lot of these traditions. Actually, no, it wasn't that. I had a student in that high school who really loved. It was funny. He told me he grew up he only really playing Roblox when he was younger in middle school, and then going from all the way from Roblox all the way to Dark Souls. Like, wow, you really jumped a chasm there. But the game he really loved was a series called Salt and Sanctuary. And looking at that and talking about that, and talking about like, well, so much of the uh, organic material of this game is derived from experiences like Castlevania, Metroid, etc. And so getting into the neat conversations about that, and that's just a lot of fun. Um, I brought in Mega Man X, one of my favorite games, as another big example, with the kind of thing, just like with Portal being such a great game that teaches people how to play the game, or like being 80 something percent tutorial, with the very opening level of Mega Man X being such a great example that just shows the player how to play that game, what to expect as a player in that game moving forward, without any sort of like, text blurbs coming up on screen of like, well, now you need to push this button to do that thing. It's like, no, just here's how we're going to show the player, you know, even the expectation, for you or I, having grown up in the time with all these various platformers where it was kind of common knowledge, but it's like with students not used to playing a game, we're like, oh, I'm expected to run from left to right. I'm expected to push this button to jump over the pit so I don't just fall straight down into it, or things like that. Or like, oh, I need to, have different enemies where if I shoot the lemons from Mega Man's, X Buster, that, some of them may hit the enemies, but some of them might have these big long legs that the lemons will just go straight through. And so how do I adapt to that? And so that was a big piece of it too. Like, how does the game help the player learn how to adapt to different circumstances without just throwing it all in the face all at once? So, and then scaling it back to working with all sorts of pen and paper, because so much of the game design comes from that as well. Even just taking a very simple game that was about sailboats making it to a harbor, I think it was called Up the River, and just looking at, here's even how you teach. Here's like their set of rules. Here's the possibility space for the game, and then talking about mods and thinking like, well, here's the bare bones of this game, but how could you tweak it just a little bit to make it a little bit more exciting or more challenging, or more adaptable to accommodate more players or something like that, and looking at all these different challenges. So that's where I got to have that wonderful experience doing that. That would be something that would be kind of a dream job if I was able to just do that class like across the board with whatever teaching position I would have in the future, perhaps. But that's the kind of thing too, where it's like, there's so much to learn from game design, of course, when you relate it to systems thinking and design thinking. And so many people talk about the wonders of STEM and STEAM and all that. And it's like, yeah, I mean, game design is so much of this. So how come we don't have game design classes in every high school in America? Like, what are we doing? So, yeah. And middle schools too. I mean, it should be, all over the place.
Oh yeah, I agree with you 100% on that one. And bringing like retro games, bringing games that are definitely like mechanic driven in a classroom definitely interests me. Like when you brought up some examples with Mega Man X, like when you bring a game like, let's say, a Sonic or a Mario or anything that is very much like a skill dependent game, like I guess what lessons or what elements are you trying to, I guess, like teach the student about playing these games? Like, I guess, like, what are you trying to get them to understand about these games that could be applied to either, learning design or building a game of their own?
Yeah, even when I think about what I did with that class, so much of the conversations and reflections that the students had was even just down to setting up the controls and having the game feel any kind of good to play. And we had this wonderful conversation, even just looking at designs of controllers over the years and thinking about like, well, why is the PlayStation controller shaped like it is? Why does it even have triangle, square, X, and circle when an Xbox controller's got letters and a Nintendo controller's got letter? Why is it A, B, X, Y? Why isn't it just A, B, C, D? And the revelations that would come out of that too, and getting providing students for opportunities to appreciate why things that they just accept and take for granted in the world of gaming, why all these different design choices are made outside of the game and inside the game. And when getting into the mechanics of it, to think about like, yeah, I mean, how can I design some situation where the player will have some understanding or have some foundation of what it is they're expected to do. Not necessarily if there's a mystery in the game, not spelling out what the answer to the mystery is, but like even just in terms of the controls and the mechanics of, all right, like Mega Man X, when I walk over to that ledge that's just a little bit close enough to, or like when that platform falls down, when I step off the broken robot that I just destroyed, and I start to lean up against the wall and I slide down, of like, oh, I've discovered how, okay, I can actually drag across the wall, and then eventually if I hit buttons, I can discover that I can climb up against the wall. How can I provide opportunities like that for the player to discover how they can use their abilities? And how do those things interact with the other elements or other characters of the game? To have all those different investigative insights into what goes in there. And then of course, the whole other tricky, nitty gritty conversations of like, well, if you're making a video game specifically, now we understand all these different things that we want to get into and make happen, how do we actually code it and do it? So, which of course, there might be, that's a whole, really, there could be like a whole pathway of game design where, like, if you're going the video game route, then of course you get into eventually to some sort of coding or working with the engine. But if you were going to go, board game, card game, LARP, ARG, like, what are the what's the skeleton of that look like if you're going to make? And I found, I know people right now are very excited about VR games and augmented reality, but when I years ago got exposure to alternate reality games, that got me really excited, because that was using real world locations to role play a scenario. And so, and what does that look like? And just to get into like the frameworks of that's there's so much that can be done there, really.
Mm-hmm. And what you said about like paper prototypes and using like RPGs and adventure games, like again, like paper prototyping has been one of the standards of kind of like the first step of game development for a lot of designers. And it's definitely something that can easily be applied to a classroom setting to get them to start thinking about, okay, how does this idea play? How does it look like to actually sit down and maybe do something in this respect? And I think that's like as you were just saying, like that I think is one of the challenges when it comes to, I guess, applying game design in the classroom. And that actually takes me to a really good question, or a really important one I wanted to ask you. And as a quick time check, we are about 48 minutes into the recording, so maybe another 10 to 12 minutes of that works for you. You have the time, Jeremy?
Sure, yeah.
One thing that I wanted to ask you about when it comes to the application of game-based learning and games in the classroom, and this is something that I've thought about a lot. This was like 6-7 years ago. I did some podcasts with developers specifically about games and education, and that challenge, at least back then, and I'm sure some of it still is there today, of getting people on board with design. And one of the big things is about the testing, or how do you prove to someone that, hey, sitting there and playing Super Mario was, educational? How do you get them to understand that, what did they get out of Mega Man X? And this takes me to that very lovely word I know every teacher loves, and that is testing. How do you test someone on game-based knowledge or game-based learning? And when we were talking about this like 6-7 years ago, we didn't really have an idea for that. So I'm going to kind of put you on the spotlight here. Like, how do you like show someone, how do you test game-based learning? Like, how do you show to someone that, hey, they didn't just sit here and play, Mario for 8 hours and they actually got something out of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is a very important question, and so much of what I've done over the years, if it was, if the class itself was about design, using an assessment framework based on some form of the design cycle is really key. Like when I first started teaching design back at Chatsworth Hills Academy, it was an international baccalaureate school, and that was a whole um, competency that the IB program had. And so I was able to reference parts of the design cycle, and the way that they graded wasn't your traditional A to F grading either. It was based on a trending system of how the students were understanding and reflecting and applying the different concepts, like the chunk having to do with, have you spent your time applying your research skills to get your own different reference materials for how to do X, Y, and Z, or talk about what's inspired your design and why you want to make the game that you're wanting to make. But then, of course, a huge chunk of the design cycle is designing those testing methods. And so, thinking about like, all right, well, if I make this game, like, what are the questions I would want to ask the player, either before, during, or after their experience, to really gauge, what they're getting out of the experience, and to think, and that gets into those skills of like, this really what people with market research do, right? Is that sort of thing. If you're talking about otherwise, in some other different class of bringing in games into that space, like I was talking about with Portal 2, that all comes from, so much of that can come from the students' written reflections, or in the case of what I had done with Portal 2 specifically, where we were working on creative writing, then looking at, the before and after of how that influenced the material that the students were able to produce. But games in and of themselves too, of course, are fantastic forms of assessment. And, when you're playing Mario and you run off, if you just run straight forward and you run straight into a Goomba, it's like, oh, I understand that that's not going to work. That's the immediate feedback loop to take advantage of that. So that's what's excited me most. It can be difficult in a sense to do that with. That's what excited me most when using EduLARP, or when hearing the Pericles group talk about how they use Practomime in the classroom. Those more live action role play kind of experiences that whatever they did in the game was directly tied to the learning objective. Like the player was doing in the game space what you wanted them to learn, but also using that skill for an organic, meaningful context of the game itself to make progress in the game. And where that all fits together. So
and showing that they can improve like their understanding is such a very tricky aspect of this. I remember this was again like 4 or 5 years ago, somewhere around there. I was hearing about like schools like in New York that are trying to have like a full like gamification class. Like this is just a entire class dedicated to gamification, using games in that respect. And I don't know if anything else like came of it since I heard about it. But is that challenge again of you're trying to like prove to someone that you can take something away from it beyond just. I think this is another interesting aspect of this, because as you've been talking about using games to teach like real world topics like this war of mine, or using games like Portal for creative writing, that there is an application to this beyond just game design. And I think that is another very interesting aspect that I can rant and rave about for like the next hour or two. So I'll be too careful. I'll try and keep that from happening. But the idea that you can improve yourself by learning video games, by learning how to deal with stuff like failure, like replayability. If you get me started, I'll rant about roguelike design for the rest of this day. It'll be night by the time everyone will see like nightfall behind you there.
Yeah.
But like, I guess like as another question for you, like beyond again just learning video games or using games to teach about games, what are some other like applications or positives that are either proven or, in your opinion, that can come about having video games as another learning source in the classroom?
I mean, part of what you just mentioned with certainly the social emotional learning aspects or the SEL. I know Matthew Farber's done a lot of work in this area. Um, you know, I mean, like we saw, of course, over the pandemic, so many people ended up gravitating towards Animal Crossing
Mhm.
and found so much that came out of that game. I mentioned Celeste a couple times, and hearing stories about how people, that game helped them a great deal with understanding and dealing with depression and anxiety. I know I've heard of, although I've not personally played yet, like Hellblade's Senua's Sacrifice is supposed to
Mm.
also be in that vein. Um, you know, um, I was trying to remember now what was the original question was.
I guess about the other applications in, I guess, like real world or a non game dev to having games in the classroom or game based learning.
Oh, so like what else would you use it for?
Like other things that people can take away from having games in the classrooms or
Oh,
using games.
of course there's, the wide variety of what a lot of people term as soft skills, which is such a weird shorthand, but of course like a lot of the communication collaboration that can come from various games. I know not as a video game, but Hanabi I talk about in that episode where the premise of that game is pretty weird, but the it being a cooperative game where you're trying to help people understand the information that they're holding and the cards in their hand that they're facing outwards and they can't see, and trying to guide people into understanding when they should execute a certain move. And there's so much that comes out of that, the communication and the collaboration skills that can't be understated, and that's so much of what people talk about when it comes to 21st century learning skills, of how we should value these all these skills that are so necessary. It's really just because we're not living in a world where rote memorization of anything is the way to go anymore. We need to
Mm-hmm.
apply critical thinking. We need to foster those communication collaboration skills and those design thinking skills, and how we can approach problems from different perspectives. And what do you do if things inevitably go haywire? How do you adapt to the situation? All of these things, games are, can be wonderful at. And so there's just so much potential there that I know I felt has just not been. It's been weird. It's been weird to me. When I worked at that nonprofit almost a decade ago at this point, we were trying to make a community and bring people together to really dive into this type of stuff. And there are, I've mentioned a bunch of different wonderful people um, who are exploring this, and there's sort of like pockets of people here and there everywhere across the world, but there, to me at least, there hasn't felt like a real cohesive community of people that have all come together, have all shared what X, Y, and Z, or what they're doing in their classrooms or researching. And um, that's something that still needs to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know. I've been looking forward to more of the games for EU chats on Twitter, but with everything going on this year, and of course with Twitter being where it is right now, I've been missing those conversations because, as you said,
Yeah.
like it is a really great source, not just for educators, but for game designers as well. To again, like I will rant and rave about onboarding and UI UX as well. Like I am resisting so much of this, like for this conversation. But it is like the soft skills, as you mentioned, they can be applied to a variety of applications. And it is, I think, a very big shame that there isn't more in that respect out there.
I think we also should really, something I've certainly been grappling with over the past year. I mean, I myself am sad to say I had joined the Great Resignation for having left the
Mm-hmm.
teaching position after being super overwhelmed, and that's a whole story that could in and of itself be
Mm-hmm.
hours. But you know, when I approach, and I'm excited about making something like Engage that can help be serve as some kind of tool or resource for this. When I originally started making the show, it was at a time when teachers were just in a better spot in the world in general. I mean, sure,
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't fantastic. Sure, there's still so many different problems in education that we're all still talking about today that were still true a decade ago plus. Um, but it was still just generally just a better time. And nowadays, I wrestle with, well, I would love to produce more episodes of Engage, but when so many classroom educators in the U.S. especially are just really grappling with just trying to keep their head above water, like we don't have the brain space to push for innovation and try to make really cool things happen when we're just trying to like manage what's right in front of us. And so like there's so much of that, and it's just that's unfortunately quite sad, you know, how so much could be done.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many lessons that could have been learned from the pandemic, but so many things were pervasive in education that teachers have been talking about for years, if not decades, well before the pandemic, and things came to a head there. But
Mm-hmm.
there was still so much opportunity to help make things better. And now I think we're at an inflection point too, where so many people have left the field, and it's just I hate to be a downer in that sense, but it's just something
Mm-hmm.
to acknowledge too of the rough spot education is in right now, both in K to 12, and I've seen many people talk about in higher ed too, how they have their own host of different problems. Um, but I don't know. These are still. It's not. Of course, it's like these are when we talk about game-based learning, gamification, using also sandbox platforms like Minecraft and Fortnite and what have you for all kinds of exciting educational applications. I mean, it's not like the demand for these things is not going away. It's not dissipating. It's only probably going to get even wider and more expansive. And so I don't know. We need to have more of a system in place to support people who would like to do these kinds of things. So, um, and that's my soapbox for the day.
Yep, and as someone who's like contacting like libraries for like doing like video game related program stuff there, like they also are having that same issue of trying to keep people engaged, trying to even keep like people working there. And again, like that's another like who knows how many hour long conversation we could have.
Mm.
Um, we are just at an hour. I don't want to keep you all day and night. I know it feels like we just got started.
Yeah,
Um,
so it's really so much to talk about.
yeah.
I feel another quick mini rant I do
Mhm.
want to squeeze in there, though, is with teaching students how to code or bringing coding into the classroom. I felt like that's been such an important thing, although there hasn't been as, at least from my perspective, as somebody who's kind of stumbled around in that vein when it comes to that part of game design too, or just the coding in general, of helping teachers learn the best ways to apply that. But I get frustrated too in thinking about games and thinking, you know, people get for whatever reason, people outside of education tend to. It seems like they get excited about, yeah, we've got kids learning how to code, but if you can get into the other aspects we talked about with learning also really the design process and game design, there's so much there that they should also be getting excited about. So mini rant over.
Yeah. And again,
um,
like there's just so many like applications that we can really get into when it comes to game-based learning beyond again just from a coding standpoint and even like we said earlier just from an esports standpoint because I think there's still people who again view the only application of video games is from the esports field. But like
mm,
we said, there is certainly a lot more you can learn from a video game, not just again from a mechanical or a gameplay perspective.
I think the esports growth has been really fascinating too, just to think about how exactly that came about, particularly in the K to 12 world. I mean,
Hmm.
how I know in earlier teacher lives, I had, I worked together with like the student council, for instance, to create a game night for kids to come. And some of it might be competitive, some of it's just for fun. and we'd raise money for everybody who came to raise money for the Child's Play charity to help children in hospitals to have some games to play. And think about things that were done earlier at the time, but nobody at that time, nobody called anything like an esports. That term wasn't a thing. So I've been really curious of like, where did this all of a sudden, or did it all of a sudden come from somewhere, or did people just brand it better? I don't know. But I know the strategy from a teacher or ed tech coach's point of view, or like in a former life being a director of ed tech and innovation, was to think about like, all right, well, if I can convince the district or the administrators, what have you, the board of education, to invest in the equipment to make esports possible, maybe then we can use the same equipment to foster game design and animation and video production, that sort of thing. And I think that has been some sort of inflection too that has really helped some people get the hardware that's needed to make this kind of thing happen. But yeah. So
yeah. And it's something, I guess, I have two final questions for you. I'm not sure how long of an answer they may be. This could be the big ones here. But
okay.
The first one I want to ask you, when, like this question is specifically for, like, game developers and designers watching this right now, kind of like where the bulk of my audience is. We've talked, again, about a lot of applications of having games in the classroom, teaching games, or being able to bring game design there. For, like, developers watching, I guess, what are, like, from a design perspective, I guess specifically, do you think are, like, the major goals of having video games in the classroom? Like, what aspects do you think, like, we want to get, like, designers on board with this idea, like, beyond just saying, learn how to make a platformer, learn how to make a first-person shooter. Like, what other applications or elements do you think, like, game-based learning can help or improve, like, the design process?
So I know for sure if I had the opportunity, I know you mentioned before you heard about in New York. I know some years ago, actually, the school, from my understanding, still exists, but Katie Salen Techenbass, had created Quest to Learn and had a partnership with the Institute of Play, which sadly no longer exists. But that's where the Institute of Play part no longer exists. But that was a framework where they had teachers and game designers working very closely together in the same environment to create these exciting game-based learning experiences. I think it's been sort of perplexing to me as to why that's not grown into a more widely adopted model, because that would be fantastic. I mean, same kind of thing where if I was, I don't know, if I was a physics teacher and I was trying to show students the value of whatever various engineering techniques, of course I'd want to work with like a structural or a mechanical or electrical engineer or something like that and bring in their expertise, because people who are in the field, of course, are going to have experiences or think of things that me as a teacher may not think about, like all the other aspects that surround, even when you get to the point of like, all right, so I've made my game, how do I go about marketing it successfully? How do I go about raising, what sort of funding approach I should use to make the game be able to, or should I go like a traditional publishing route? Should I do some other, all that kinds of stuff. Or even, if it was a video game, talking about various engines or various platforms of what's the advantages, disadvantages to X, Y, and Z, or all that sort of thing. There's so much there that I know as a teacher I would have loved to like bring in the people who are the experts also in that avenue to help make that more well-rounded for the learning experience.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And again, like, I know a lot of people who would have loved to have had an actual like game dev course in not elementary school, but like in high school and that. Because again, like I've spoken to developers who go through college courses. I even just interviewed like three college students who are taking game dev here
Mhm.
on the East Coast earlier this week, and it is tough to. A lot of the courses that deal with game dev or game design are very wide in their applications, but for like if you're trying to get into indie dev, there are some very specific things you need to learn and understand if you want to have any chance of making a successful game. Again, we're talking about stuff like project management, about looking at different engines, social media, publishing. Like again, these are topics that we certainly do not have the time to get into here. But this is stuff that, and I say this to a lot of the students who take some of my virtual programs when I talk about getting into the game industry, that it's stuff that it's better to learn when you're in school
Mm.
than to fail at and then learn it when you're trying to, have a livelihood doing this stuff.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, that can't be understated enough for sure.
hmm So here's my final question, and again, I'm hoping I'm not keeping you too over because I really am enjoying this conversation.
I know this has been fantastic.
This is something that I talk a lot about when it comes to game design specifically, and the importance of learning it. That we've talked again over the course of this discussion, and I've had plenty of discussions about learning, programming, learning art, learning these hard skills. That again, if you learn programming, you can apply that to other fields. If you become a really good artist, that can be used beyond just video games. But game design specifically, and again, this is where I focus, of course, on that. I still feel like even not just in the classroom, but even like in the industry as itself, is still very misunderstood as to how
Mm.
important it is. That being able to sit down and say, what makes good platformer mechanics? What makes, again, I can just go through my rant for the fifth time. But the question I want to ask you as an educator, do you feel that game design itself, again, separate from programming, separate from art and all that, is that something that is growing in terms of being its own teachable subject? Because this is something that I ask a lot, or I bring up a lot in my library talks, that can we see like game design being like as much of a focus of a semester or a course as spending a semester learning how to do coding or taking an art course? And it's a question that I think I don't really have, I think, a solid answer to. And I want to get your thoughts on this again, as someone who has seen games in the classroom, who has been trying to bring it in that respect.
I mean, I would say personally, absolutely.
Mhm.
I would want to see it as an independent discipline, if you will, of because it's weird it strikes me as weird, but of course, being in that frame of mind, um, why it would be necessary to advocate for this being its own worthy discipline in a school. And it's like with all that we've talked about, and with so much more that we haven't even covered because it's just an overwhelming amount. It's
Mhm.
like, of course, it's valuable. So it should be perceived just as valuable as like your math class, your English class, whatever.
Mhm.
And I guess people talk about with any sort of discipline, like what are the transferable skills, and just with teaching as well. It's like here's my giant laundry list of all the
Mhm.
transferable skills. Of course, I'd be highly qualified to do all kinds of different fields of work, if not game design specifically, or if not teaching specifically. Um, so yeah, I mean,
Mhm.
I'm in the camp certainly of thinking that, of course, just like with media arts in general, just like visual arts, there's
Mhm.
certainly value to all of these different disciplines. And yeah, but I mean, I guess it's if we're trying to answer the question of why it's not talked about as widely, I don't know. That's certainly something I've been puzzled about too, because even in my past teacher experiences, to even um,
Mhm.
propose to try and do a class on video production in a place that has never had one before, um, I guess, that could be, even though games have existed for such a long time, the I guess general public perception of like, well, here's what it is to be a filmmaker and a movie maker, for some reason is more widely understood, I guess, than what does it mean to be a game designer. Um, but if we had more straight up game design classes in schools over time, then that would certainly help people to understand, like, oh, I mean, I see, the different industry applications that one could get into, and you know, so.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And again, it's a topic that we can certainly talk about for a very long time, but I think we'll end things here again before you're just standing around like all day talking with me. But if you are free in the future, I'd love to have more conversations about this with you.
Sure. I mean, this is certainly an area I'm very passionate about. Um, you know, I've mentioned offhandedly my various teacher lives, and I've gone through a variety of different roles in the field, but it is something I've been passionate about for many years, and would love for that to be my day job. I would love to you know have game design
Mm-hmm.
classes be the core of what I do. But yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where it's like, for some reason, just like even a director of educational technology, if you would think in the year 2022, it's like, of course, all school systems need somebody in that role to help people
Mm-hmm.
learn media literacy and to maximize the use of, like, integrate their tech. But it's like, but it's that gets also to why, looking at how um, school systems in general are just wildly undersupported and underfunded, or not funded appropriately, and this and that. So I don't know, these are all things, yeah, I could certainly talk about for hours, days, weeks, months.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. um and I'm sure, I'm sure in time I'll have more content coming up on Engage. I'm not sure exactly when, since I'm a bit in flux at the moment, trying to figure out, what are next steps for me career wise. But certainly, if there's anybody out there watching this who anything that we've discussed are like, yes, I know what that guy's talking about, I would love to work with him, then come find me. So.
All right. And you don't have to mention it here, but if you have a chance, if there's any like resources or articles about game-based learning or games education that people can look at, definitely like send them over to me, and I'll include them in the show notes down below.
Okay, sure.
All right. So I think with that, we will wrap things up for our episode. Jeremy, again, it has been a pleasure hanging out with you this afternoon. And yeah, definitely don't be a stranger. If you'd like to have another discussion about this, or if you know any other teachers who are like having programs or courses they'd like to come on and discuss, definitely let me know or mention my name. I'd love to have them.
Okay, absolutely.
Besides the Engage show, which I have a link to already in the description, anywhere else social media wise or anything else you'd like to plug before I let you go for tonight?
I know a great place to reach me. I would ordinarily say on Twitter, but knowing what Twitter
Mm-hmm.
is right now,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Certainly on LinkedIn, people could find me. I think it's linkedin.com/in/J Yanofsky. Or, if you type in Jeremy Yanofsky in LinkedIn, I should be. I'm not the only Jeremy Yanofsky in the world, but I'm sure I'll be on there. Um, I don't know. It's a tricky. I mean, youtube.com/engage show. I mean, I am on Twitter at Mr. Y, spelled like the word mystery,
Mm-hmm.
186. Um, but, given everything that it has unfortunately befallen Twitter, I'm probably going to eventually migrate over to something like Hive or Mastodon or something. Um, I mean, I am on Discord as well, but I don't know how much, to what extent people. I don't know. The world of Discord is an interesting riddle to me, in the sense of like,
Mm-hmm.
I see how exciting it is, but it doesn't seem to me like Twitter, where things are discoverable as Twitter
Mm-hmm.
would be. Like Discord seems like you find your community and you're in your community and you're all set. It doesn't seem like, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yep.
So yeah, I guess just go for that. I am on Instagram too, but I don't really use Instagram a heck of a lot because uh, I don't know. I just liked Twitter more before. so so there you go.
Oh yes. And again, we can rant here for sure on all these topics, especially about trying to find people and so on
Mm.
when it comes to Discord. And I have my own Discord as well. It is up there in the corner. There's my shameless plug. But Jeremy, again, it has been fantastic hanging out with you. As again, someone who studies and talks game design until the cows come home. Like I love having these conversations.
Well, thank you, and it's been such an honor to be here, and thank you so much for having me.
So, with that, everyone, we're going to say goodnight. I don't know if this will be the last live Perceptive podcast for 2022, but it may be one of the final ones. And thank you, Tarith, for watching and for checking things out. So, everyone, if you've been enjoying this live or recorded, thank you for tuning in. You'll find links to Jeremy's stuff in the description down below. Again, if you're over here, do the liking, subscribing, and commenting. Check out the Discord, Patreon. I am still on Twitter, but again, as Jeremy said, whatever's happening on there, who knows what will be updated in the coming, who knows, days, weeks, or months, depending upon when this is going up. And as I always say, if you are a developer working on an upcoming game, an educator teaching or has more thoughts about games in the classroom, or you're just someone who wants to talk about the craft of game dev or any aspect of game development, please reach out. I am always looking for guests. You can, message me here, Twitter, email. There are lots and lots of ways. So, with all that said, come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where some of are on science of games. And until our next show, have a great night. Take care, everybody.